We asked the audience to share some of their thoughts in advance, and there were quite a few questions that were touching on that whole measurement question. So I'm going to just take two of those first. And so first of all, Melvin.
Okay, Melvin Garrett, Devon and Cornwall Housing. Do we have the standard measurements and tools to know whether organisations are really taking a route to aid a sustainable future and therefore allow comparability and resulting competition between organisations within the same industries and also between sectors?
And Pamela?
Thank you. So how do we value and put a price on fresh water as a scarce resource? How do we create a sustainable business case for water extractive industries, agriculture, beverages, as well as traditional industry and mining and so forth? So life can sustain itself, albeit very differently, without oil, but it can't without water. So what do we do?
Right, so those two questions. Liz, you had been touching on some of the work that you've been doing on measurement. Mm-hmm. So do we need more standardisation, or actually are we nearly there? And as a water company, what's your top tip for valuing water?
Okay, on the first one, we face a dilemma really, because what I talked about we'd been doing was kind of making it up as we go along, but using some of the tools and techniques out there. So I can't pretend it's a precise piece of work. What I can say is that it's told us enough to know that we need to behave differently. Now, when we're thinking about measurement and making investment decisions between companies, that's a whole different situation. But that's not to say that those tools and techniques can't be standardised in the fullness of time, and the quicker the better, such that methodologies could be put out there on an industry-by-industry basis, because every company is different and every industry is different. There's no reason why the IARC couldn't develop, for example, going forward, to allow some basic methodologies around some of the fundamental reportings. And I think the sooner the better. On water, I really wish I knew how to value water. I think what happens with water and what matters with water is the amount of damage one creates whilst extracting water from the environment. So, for example, in a country that's scarce of water and is using non-replenishable aquifers to grow crops or to produce something that is then shipped out to another country, that's a really serious issue. It's about the replenishment of that water resource. That, to me, has a very high marginal cost associated to it. Here in the UK, I think that in different regions we face different issues, actually. In Yorkshire, we're very lucky that it rains quite a lot. And I'd like to say that a water company, we like nothing more than a good steady drizzle is the ideal. And we get quite a lot of that too. But in fact, as I was trying to explain before, the way we abstract from the rivers in Yorkshire, we don't damage the biodiversity, we actually protect the environment. And of course, it rains a lot, so it replenishes the nature takes care of it. It's what's rather called ecosystem services, or I don't really like that term. So we don't do a lot of damage. The damage we do, as I've said before, is in the greenhouse gas emissions that we create as providing that service. There are parts of the UK, however, where rivers dry up in the summer because of the abstraction. And the cost of that is the ecosystem, the biodiversity that has disappeared during that summer, and to which there is a much higher cost. I can't give a precise answer, but I think it depends.
Anne Adrain, who had a question more than on the innovation side of things.
With technology and innovation, most noticeably that of a disruptive nature, continuing to evolve at a rapid pace, how do you envisage that this might lead to the creation of new markets and initiatives that provide opportunities for a greater push towards a more environmentally, socially and economically sustainable future?
Great. And Brian?
Thank you. So how important is the role of governments in applying regulation, the objective being less about mandating compliance and more to ensuring a level playing field for corporations to encourage action and increase effectiveness. And the background to this being that certain actions are required to improve long-term sustainability, but they may impact short-term profitability, which may put a corporation at risk in today's short-sighted markets, or could possibly be undermined by lack of cohesive action amongst relevant participants or by other externalities. So while regulation could be a blunt instrument, it might alleviate these concerns and encourage corporations to take bolder actions.
Great. So, Judith, I'm going to put Anne's question of innovation to you, and Steve, to give you a warning, you can pick up on regulation.
I do think that innovation technology is a great enabler, but where it's used with caution, and I can think of lots of things in our own business where we've invested large sums of money in things that weren't very practically useful. So I think it's easy to get seduced by technology, and I'm probably one of those people that it is easy to seduce with new technology because I love it. But when it goes beyond what is practically possible for us to manage in a real sense, then we have to be careful. But I think that question links back to the previous question, because we have got huge technology and innovation happening in lots of different supply chains all around the world, but none of them are talking to each other. And one of the things that we need to do is to understand where the standards bodies, and not just in accounting, but in ISO standards for technology, for data and measurement, need to take an active role, and what role indeed something like the UK Statistics Authority play in that, in the way that we collect data from this technology and use that data in a standardised way. And I think the other point I'd add to that is through the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we've got a unique opportunity to do that, because we're all struggling with how we're going to measure our performance against those goals, and that's a global challenge. So the UN goals do represent an opportunity for us to establish an international language and international metrics to measure what matters, and indeed to make sure the technology and innovation that we apply improves those measurements. Yeah.
And maybe that can at least provide part of Mark's answer in terms of evolving towards a bit of consensus. Okay, there are lots of frameworks out there, but at least that is something that has got that global recognition and might provide a bit of consolidation in terms of what does sustainability mean, or what are we trying to strive towards. Steve, from a regulatory perspective, where would you, what would your advice be there?
Well, I think the point is an excellent one, which is if you don't have a sort of level playing field globally in terms of the impact of regulation, then you can put your domestic industry at a disadvantage, or advantage it against other players in the industry, when we're all actually competing in global markets and we're competing for scarce capital. And we've seen that happen. In Canada, we have a benefit in that the Canadian regulator is seen as very strong and prudent, and we went through the financial crisis with no bailouts, etc. And so we benefit from having a very strong regulator. On the other hand, we also have a challenge from having a very strong regulator. So if you actually calculate the amount of capital we have to carry versus some of our international competitors, it's probably more. So that's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think the issue, though, of regulation is very, very important in this sustainability context, because I think we get some mixed messages sometimes from the top tiers of world governance, if you like. So on the one hand, we have the Financial Stability Board, which is rightly concerned about insufficient investment in infrastructure. So infrastructure investment is a massive issue. And the best natural investors in infrastructure assets are insurers and pension funds, who have very, very long-term and very significant pools of asset or money to deploy into long-term assets, because they have such long-term liabilities. And so we are a very natural investor into solar energy projects, infrastructure projects, you name it. We're absolutely natural for that. We need assets that we believe will be there to pay claims in 60 years' time, 70 years' time, 80 years' time. On the other hand, if you then go to individual regulators, individual jurisdictions around the world, they have drifted over the last several years to being more and more conservative, and they basically penalise you for doing just about anything other than issuing, firstly issuing short-term products as opposed to long-term products. Well, that's not great from a sustainability point of view, because you want to be able to offer people protection for the long term, but you get penalised effectively for offering long-term products, because the regulators will force you to pad your discount rate assumptions and all of these other things to the extent that it becomes unsustainable to offer long-term products. And if you don't offer long-term products, well, then you don't need the long-term investments, and therefore you don't find yourself investing in long-term infrastructure assets. And, by the way, even if you do invest in long-term infrastructure assets, you'll have some banker somewhere, sorry, that's probably an offensive comment, but someone telling you that the risk associated with investing in a stable, fixed-income infrastructure asset is way higher than investing in public equities, and therefore you better carry 3 times as much capital. So the regulatory regimes tend to be set up to discourage the issuance of long-term protection products, and they tend to be set up to discourage investment in long-term infrastructure. So we really need an urgent alignment between the interests of the world at large and the concerns of the Financial Stability Board on the one hand, and the regulators on the other, who forever want to add more and more conservatism into our solvency regimes.
Final 2 very quick questions, which pick on the themes of investors. So first of all, Frederic Lamotte, over here, and then Mark Thompson. So Frederic.
More a question about on the asset management, asset owner side. In order to maximize impact in terms of sustainability, would finance not be better off globalizing the whole investment product space under various shades of green, rather than focusing on the Manichaean approach of good investment product versus bad products?
Okay, and Mark?
Maybe this is for Mark, really. Should all UK pension schemes have an explicit climate change policy in their statement of investment principles?
Okay, so Mark, you're going to pick up on both of those. So should products be various shades of green or potentially brown, I guess? And yes, no to the final question.
Well, that's an easy one from Mr. Thompson. Yes. I think all pension funds should. It's a significant long-term risk, so it should be. All investors should take account of it.
And I guess I'm going to add a subsidiary one to that as well. Of should all companies be doing what HSBC Pension Fund has just done, which is make their default DC scheme also be thinking about these kind of issues? You only have a yes/no to that one as well.
Well, if all I'm allowed is a yes or no, then I would say yes. But it's not the only solution.
Yeah. Shades of green?
Shades of green, that's an interesting one. I think the underlying part of the question is how do we, if we're selecting an investment product or a type of investment, how do we measure success? So the first part of that is we should measure success over an appropriate period of time, as opposed to some of the short-term time periods, quarterly, even annually, or 3 years that we tend to do now. And then how do we define success? So it's very easy sometimes to define financially, but you need to define the financial elements in a way which are much more linked to the objectives of the investor rather than the individual product or solution that you've bought. So if we invest in equities, we should get an equity risk premium over time, a return that's in excess of our liabilities, as opposed to, as I said earlier, we should just beat a benchmark. I mean, perhaps the point you make about shades of green is similar to the one we're starting to think about in our group at PRI on the real economy influence. And we're thinking green's probably the wrong, I'm not sure what the right colour is, but it's probably the wrong colour because we're going beyond, I think, what green tends to imply, the environmental side, to also include some of the more social and demographic changes and so on. How we would do it, I guess, is the problem. But I think if we can find some metrics and or qualitative or quantitative and measures of success, which we can start integrating into the investment decision-making process alongside the financial factors, I think absolutely.
Great. So I'm not sure we've necessarily got to the heart of whether we have all the knowledge needed, but I have to say, I think we have to act on the knowledge that we have. And I think there's lots of examples here of how you can, and lots of examples in the room from the discussions today and yesterday. So my one call to everyone in this room is to take action, which I'm sure many of you already are, to work with us to help get that action out to everyone. I think it's still very clear that the knowledge, even the knowledge that is out there, doesn't get to everyone who needs to have it. So if you speak to 5 people and get them on board. I think His Royal Highness a few years ago ran the numbers, and it doesn't take long to really get to global domination if everyone speaks to 5 and they speak to 5. So final thing is for a quick vote. So do you agree? Hold up green. We have all the knowledge needed for a sustainable future. We just need to act upon it. Or red if you disagree. And you can sort of be half-hearted and hold up both. Okay. Excellent. So I think it's very clear there that action is the way forward.